So, the Dead by Daylight community is currently on fire with discussion, somehow more than it usually is. These past few weeks has had a lot of talk amongst the community about whether Killer is more difficult now than it has been in the past. Instead of just adding another opinion to the already massive pile of opinions that you've already heard, I decided to take a different route. I love DbD, so it's hard for me to take off the proverbial rose-tinted glasses and look at the current state of Killer in the game. Instead of just giving you an 8-minute view of me complaining about the heal meta and then calling it quits, I wanted to look at the entirety of the year for Killer and cover that. So, Survivor mains, before you click off and go to the comments to say something mean, just give me a chance here, because I'm not going to do the usual Killer player thing and shift all the blame onto you. If you watch the video and still think I'm being uncharitable, then feel free to do it. This video is going to cover everything that has been a direct change to the Killer role over the course of this year, while also looking at a few select Survivor changes during this time period. To be entirely honest, before researching for this video, I'd usually roll my eyes at the people who are doom posting about how weak Killers are. I'm sure you see it everywhere and get exhausted too, but the constant shouting about just how bad Killer is was something that genuinely annoyed me. Because, well, if I'm still winning most of my matches, then surely Killer can't be that bad. Before we get to that point though, let's first explain everything that will be covered in this video. The role of Killer as a whole, obviously, but to dive deeper into that, we'll be discussing the apparent blueprint of Killer design over the year, the redundancy of lower tiers, and the oppression of the high tiers. Then, we'll move into the idea of Survivor meta being tied to the strength of the higher tier Killers. Now, let's begin with this. I actually think that Killer isn't as weak as people are making out to be. It's absolutely in the dirt in comparison to how it was a few years ago, or honestly even a few months ago, but I'm still winning the vast majority of my matches. Granted, you shouldn't really consider the success of a player with nearly 7,000 hours the balancing point of the game. My major thing with Killer is that the role just kind of feels bad to play in comparison to how it did not even a year ago. I think a lot of people are generally confusing weakness for just being a pretty bad experience. Yes, Killer is almost objectively weaker than it was before the Five Nights at Freddy's patch, but it's not as if Survivor is so much stronger. So let's begin to truly elaborate on some of these talking points I want to bring up. I want to begin by looking at some of the most recent sets of nerfs to the Killer role that we've seen over this past year. The ones that came to mind for me were Kaneki, the Xenomorph, Chucky, and of course, Skull Merchant. They were all nerfed with the intention of making them more counterable for survivors, but overall just ended up making each of these killers feel generally worse to play. With the exception of Xenomorph, who had his changes reverted after the community banded together to fight the idea. I also want to add that I still find Chucky incredibly fun and satisfying to play, but I know a lot of people dropped him after his changes in December. However, it's undeniable that these changes would, and honestly did, cause people to drop the characters a bit. For example, Kaneki, he's still extremely popular, but he does undeniably feel a bit worse to play, and while personally I was never really a fan of him or his design, I would be lying if I said the way behavior changed him was a smart or satisfying way. Instead of properly nerfing Kaneki in a meaningful way, they just made him feel a bit worse to play. Sure, the killer is weaker, but he's still one of the absolute best killers in the game, he just feels kinda bad to play. Xenomorph's changes thankfully didn't go through due to the begging from the community. However, as we saw in the PTB, not only was it an attack towards the Xenomorph's strength, but also majorly hit the fun factor, forcing Xenomorph players to leave chases to return to portals in order to try and get her power back. Fortunately, the changes didn't go through, and Xenomorph got some changes that it desperately needed in order to keep her strong, yet a bit more fun to play against. In order to not keep repeating myself, I'm going to save the rest of my Xenomorph discussion for a later part of the video, so let's go ahead and put a pin in her, for now, and we'll come back to it later on. There is one killer that I do briefly want to talk about though, and that is the Skull Merchant. Merchant was nerfed in patch 8.3.0, essentially soft deleting her from the game because they couldn't just full commit and delete the character. The legitimate reasoning put behind this was that the Skull Merchant was just so despised that behavior wanted to wash their hands of the killer and just move on from her. This is the first massive example of the seemingly scorched earth nerfing style that behavior took with her and then attempted to follow up with Chucky and the Xenomorph. Thankfully, it was abandoned for the time being at least. The nerfs we've been seeing more recently are actually more down to earth than they were at this time. While the major nerfs this year were conceptually difficult to get behind, there's another side to this coin, and that is, depending on how you view Dead by Daylight, either a very good thing or a very bad thing. This past year, we've seen a total of 4 brand new killers, with 3 soft reworks and an additional 1 proper rework to the killer cast. Going off my research, we saw direct buffs to 21 of the 40 unique killers in the roster. That's about 52%, meaning that just over half of the cast saw direct buffs to their kits. But hey, I'm sure you didn't need me to tell you that. First though, let's talk about the 4 newest killers added to the game, and briefly discuss what they have in common with each other. the Dark Lord, the Houndmaster, the Ghoul, and the Animatronic. Something that I immediately noticed when looking at this list is that they're all decently strong killers, Animatronic being the weakest, but still a perfectly acceptable killer, with Dracula or Ghoul being the high point of this year in terms of strength. Going off the year though, it seems behavior has begun to take note of what the community seemingly likes in a killer. What I've noticed is that these killers all share a bit of a trend: mobility, a dash, or an ability that allows them to tunnel easily. For examples, Dracula has the bat form to move quickly across the map, Houndmaster can utilize the patrol path, Kaneki can leap large distances, and Springtrap can use the security doors to teleport quickly to the other side of the map. As for the dash aspect of my theory, Dracula has the wolf form, which is severely power crept Wesker. Houndmaster has the chase command, which, depending on who you ask, could be considered a projectile, but due to the ability to re-aim snug, I personally see as more of a dash. Kaneki is pretty self-explanatory, it's probably the purest form of a dash in the game. Finally, we have Springtrap, who, granted, does not have a dash, meaning he did break this trend. But he falls into another popular genre of killer, that being one with a projectile. I feel like the final part of a power that I've noticed is the tunneling ability, which, to give behavior credit, I don't think is necessarily intentional. No matter your stance on tunneling, if you're going to be completely fair, tunneling does, at times, have to happen for a killer to win a match. I am personally not a fan of tunneling, but at the end of the day, if the killer tunnels me with one generator left, that's really just how Dead by Daylight works. Anyways, Dracula's Hellfire allows for him to hit multiple survivors at a hook, at one time. Houndmaster, probably the weakest at the fort tunneling, can use the dog to prevent a would-be body blocker from getting in her way. Kaneki can use his leap to maneuver around survivors' teammates, and Springtrap can throw the axe to immediately chew through the survivors' deep wounds. I mean, hey, if you want to go back just a bit, you can also apply a lot of this to current-day VECNA too. The fly is very similar to a dash. I'm not really quite ready to call VECNA a dash killer, but it is very close. Not to mention the large amount of distance that can be gained from fly as well. You can also count that the mage hand can lead to quick hits on survivors who just came off the hook, same with a well-timed fly to the damned. I mean, it's almost certainly a pattern, and depending on your taste in killer design, this will lead you to either liking this or not. Judging by who the most popular killers are, Wesker, Blight, and Huntress, at least one killer this year has an element borrowed from one of them each. But since this is my video, and I'm going to give my opinions on all this, I personally find a lot of the dash killer with strong tunneling ability blueprint to be extremely worn out, and I would like to see something more than the same idea taken and twisted up a bit. The biggest stray from the formula was Springtrap, who still had 3 incredibly common aspects to his kit: teleporting, projectile, and the ability to tunnel well. I would really like us to be given something interesting and unique. Dead by Daylight, for example, suffers from a lack of good trap killers. The two we have are both god-awful, and rarely see any play from anyone who has put any real time in the game, or people who decided to main those characters. At one point, the Skull Merchant was a halfway decent trap killer, but as we covered earlier, behavior decided to put her on ice until they could figure out something that they want to do with her, which seemingly includes throwing her extremely expensive drones at people. Nice. However, since this is not my forte, if you want to hear more, I recommend you go and watch Pixelbush's wonderful video covering trap killers in DbD. The video is a bit old at this point, but it still has some incredible insight as to the history of a class of killers that has been neglected and seemingly removed from the design wheel. While the new killers this year are all decently strong, there's been a lot more shakeups than just them, as I hinted at earlier. This year we received 4 behavior branded reworks to some killers who needed them the most. Each killer chosen represented a flaw in design when it comes to this game: weak, complex, problematic, and overtuned. The 4 horsemen of the killer design apocalypse. That's a bit dramatic, but I just wanted a cute title for this section of the video. Hey, funnily enough, I have videos covering each of these killers listed in this area. Our first reworks to talk about are to the Knight and the Singularity, which happened at the same time. The Knight was chosen due to a problematic kit that was beyond a slog to play against. Drop a guard at the pallet, the survivor has to hold W away, rinse and repeat. Singularity was an extremely complex, yet rewarding killer that took a bit more skill and pre-planning from the killer player. However, because of that, he was not very popular among players who just wanted to turn their brain off and kick pallets, which, hey, nothing wrong with that. Demogorgon's one of my favorite killers. I love chewing on pallets. Chucky was reworked in November due to just being a bit overwhelming in chase. A lot of us were quick to call for reverse to the nerf, but truth be told, I actually think this ended up being the best state Chucky has ever been in. He's still very strong once you get used to the new timings for his power, but he's also much more reactable for a more patient survivor player. And the last one was Freddy, who got a proper rework instead of the usual massive air quotes here, rework that behavior gives us. So, I want to briefly cover each of the effects the reworks had on their killer. Like I said earlier, I covered each of these killers in their own video if you want to check those out. Links will be in the description. The Knight is unfortunately still extremely disliked by most of the Survivor player base. Despite that, I think he is genuinely one of the best designed killers in the game, with a skill ceiling that rewards smart placement of patrol paths while punishing the irritating immediate pincer playstyle that was used by most of the Knight's player base. Overall, I think the Knight has ended up in a fantastic spot, somewhere in the low to middle side of the B tier, with lots of room for a player to master him. The next killer is Singularity. Let's go ahead and make this clear right away. Singularity is absolutely one of the best killers in the game today. Look at the majority of experienced players' tier list and you'll see Singularity consistently landing in the top 10. While I don't mind a killer being strong, I do think it's incredibly disappointing for a killer to lose a lot of the character in pursuit of the strength offered to them. For example, let's look back at Freddy's rework in July of 2019. For a long time, this rework made Freddy one of the best characters in the game, until he was subsequently nerfed. The biggest criticism levied at it was that Freddy lost a lot of the personality and charm that made the character fun to play. For me, personally, this is the exact same situation for Singularity. I really enjoyed the killer pre-rework, but following his changes, I've had trouble getting back into playing him. It feels like the training wheels are not only on, but have been made the main part of the character. Hey, if you don't feel that way and you enjoy the new Singularity, I'm genuinely happy for you. But Hux was already a solid killer with one of the highest skill ceilings in the game, and now he just feels so cookie cutter to me. Moving on from Hux, we had to wait a few months till our next rework in the form of the Good Guy. Patch 8.4.1 released and saw changes to Chucky's speed, power, charge time, and length of his dash. As soon as these changes were live, people were immediately calling the character dead. However, truth be told, Chucky was, and is still, completely fine. Like I said earlier, this is probably the best state he's ever been in terms of still being strong with a reasonably high skill ceiling. It's important to remember that survivors are also people playing the game, and behavior needs to make balance changes in their favor too. More on that later on. Slowing Chucky down was done to make him more reactable for Survivor without slowing him to a point where a hit was laughably difficult. His buff in the Tokyo Ghoul patch has pretty much perfected Chucky in my opinion. This is a great example of how to nerf a killer instead of butchering them like was done to Merchant and attempted for Xenomorph. The pain points were addressed and mostly fixed, while still keeping the killer in a healthy area of strength. Finally, we have reached the final rework. For those of you who have been around for a while, I'm sure you already know how I feel about this. What can I say that I haven't already said? In January of 2025, we saw the much anticipated rework to the Nightmare, Freddy Krueger himself. Freddy's rework was something that we had waited a long time to get. Expectations were extremely high, but to say that my personal expectations were not only matched but exceeded wouldn't be doing this rework justice. Freddy went from an extremely weak killer with a very low skill floor and ceiling to a pretty strong killer with a low skill floor yet very high skill ceiling. I really shouldn't go into another rant about how much I love this version of Freddy. I've done it so many times at this point that most people just know about it that watch my videos. But you know what? It's my video, so screw it. I love Freddy's kit. There's just so much fun to it. And honestly, if you don't care about a kid having fun aspects, he's also strong. The teleport mind game to trick the shirtless David into running directly into your waiting arms. You don't care about that? The dream projection is a wonderful ability to get to the other side of the map to pressure the survivors who you wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise. The Dream Snap provides a great tool to catch up, paired with Rapid Brutality or Save the Best for Last for the quick recovery, and it'll scratch your brain in a way that you've never seen before. Don't care about that? At the very basic level, the Snare is a hinder to apply in between or while in loops to gain ground and get a hit. And finally, we have officially reached peak. The Dream Pallets, at the most basic level, provides you with a zoning tool to keep survivors from reaching a safer area, while getting an occasional down. At the higher end,
so, tall you fine dandies, so proud, so cocksure, prancing about with your heads full of eyeballs. Come and get me, I say. I'll be waiting on you with a whip of the old brimstone. I'm a grim, bloody fable with an unhappy, bloody end. Oh, they're going to have to glue you back together in hell!
So yeah, basically, I love Freddy. The reworks this year were exceptionally good, bringing some of the more lower tier and lower played characters into the spotlight that they had not had over the past few years. or in the case of the Knight, attempting to shift the attention to a more positive stance. This is for me personally the high point for Killer this year. 3 of the 4 reworks have made me like the Killer more, while the 4th rework has undeniably made the Killer more popular for the majority of the Killer players who play the game. As I mentioned earlier, we have had 21 buffs to Killers this past year. I went through every major chapter and mid-chapter this year to find every change made. However, in order to keep this section relatively short, I'm going to group the Killers up into a few different areas. The first group is Killers who were changed in a relatively small way. The second group of Killers are Killers who were changed in substantial ways. The size of these two groups are nowhere near being the same, but both are better than nothing. Let's talk about the first group. Slinger, Bubba, Ghostface, Demogorgon, Dredge, Legion, Doctor, and VECNA, who I will be discussing again, were all given some small buffs to their base kit to nudge them in the right direction in terms of balance. However, the devil is in the details with these buffs. Every single one of them came paired with nerfs to their add-ons. Unfortunately, this caused people to continue using the same add-ons for the most part, not really moving the needle in the slightest for any of these Killers, which I think is the most important part of the entire thing. Despite these Killers receiving buffs, there is very little actual ground gained. On the other side of the coin though, there were some Killers who got some major buffs this year. Nemesis, the Xenomorph, and the Lich, hello again, were given very solid buffs, with either a very slight downside, or almost no real downside at all. Let's start with the Xenomorph. Xeno has always been a solid killer since it was released in August of 2023. However, over time, gradually began to fall victim to power creep. Players began asking for buffs to the character. How did behavior respond? They wanted the nerfer. To give you the fastest version of this, Xenomorph was slated for some changes in the Tokyo Ghoul patch, which would have drastically increased the amount of time she was in the stage of being burnt. This was thankfully reverted, meaning the Xenomorph was honestly kind of buffed in a small way, with the caveat of her tail taking a bit longer to charge now. Pair this with the add-on pass that the Xenomorph received, and we're in a position where the killer is in a pretty solid state in terms of strength, counterplay, and general fun factor. Moving on though, we have a somewhat similar situation in the form of the Nemesis T-type, or simply known as the Nemesis. That was so fucking smug. Before this update, Nemesis suffered quite a bit from his early game. In order to keep the ball rolling at a decent pace, before his changes it would take 4 whips on survivors to reach tier 2, or to infect 2 separate survivors, or 3 whips on a survivor and then whipping a zombie. It was super weird. His early game was so weak. Granted, the ramp up was pretty strong, meaning later in the game Nemesis would become a very solid killer. Once he received a buff in 8.2.0, Nemesis' early game was buffed majorly. Now his whip would give him tier 2 and 3 hits on 1 single survivor, base kit. The whip's range was made larger as well, and the hinder was being increased quite a bit. This is one of the 2 major straight up buffs to a killer without any nerfs accompanying them that we got this year. Speaking of major straight up buffs, VECNA slithered his way into this video at the very last minute with a huge buff in the 9.0.0 update, where literally everything related to VECNA's power received buffs to make them all around stronger. I don't want to say much about this because I'm sure you've all seen new VECNA. He is very good, and honestly could probably end up getting nerfed. Side note, I don't think he should be nerfed, but who knows if it'll happen or not. Point being, VECNA has had a massive glow up since he was released 1 year ago. Literally every part of his power has been substantially improved, to the point of him looking like an entirely different killer. However, the downside of buffs like this, Nemesis and VECNA to a lesser extent, they have a severe lack of decent add-ons. While the killer's base kit is extremely solid, they are now in an area where their add-ons are chosen for them essentially, making it extremely easy to predict them for survivors. It really comes down to what you prefer in terms of killer design. Either a weaker base kit with better all-around add-ons, or a stronger base kit with worse add-ons. But even what I would consider the best buffs have had some new issues accompanying them. Now that I've covered all the changes over the past year, I want to talk about something that I think has plagued killers for years and years. Something you can trace all the way back to the literal very beginning of the game. The discrepancy in strength. In order to put this in the most simple terms, before I begin my expanded discussion about it, I think it is very difficult to properly balance things when Blight and Skull Merchant are playing on the same maps against the same survivors. No matter what your stance is on this, you have to acknowledge that Eyrie of Crows is 2 entirely different experiences depending on if you're playing a top tier or a bottom tier. It seems that as the years have gone by, the game has become more and more balanced around the strong killers, which, on one hand, I completely understand. Whether you like it or not, survivors do need to have things to help them stay competitive with the killers who are dominating the meta. On the other hand though, there's another 35 killers in the game who are hurt exponentially more than the top 5 or top 6 in the killers who just don't care about any of it. Some examples of this exact situation are perks like Shoulder the Burden, pre-nerf Babysitter, and even current Babysitter, Vigil, Decisive Strike being used aggressively, Boons, and honestly, Exhaustion as a whole. These perks are all fine against the best killers in the game, but against everyone else, they are exponentially stronger than they really ever should be. With the game giving survivors extremely strong new tools to try and help them against the best killers in the game, it only widens the gap between the best of the best and everyone else. Something else I noticed is that the existence of these top tier killers has, at least in my opinion, led to the nerf of perks that were very much needed for most of the killers in the game. It's no secret that slowdown perks have been hit pretty hard over the past calendar year, with massive nerfs, mostly in patch 8.0, where Grim Embrace, Pop Goes the Weasel, Deadlock, and Pain Resonance were all given nerfs to the amount of gen regression or gen blocking they provided. While most of these perks are still somewhere in the killer meta, the effectiveness of each of them has been hit quite hard. Except for the killers who have the mobility to get continued pressure and the lethality to end chases quickly, which are traits of the best killers in the game. I now want to talk about bottleneck balancing. This is something that refers to a certain character or ability preventing other added or reworked mechanics from being made strong, due to it becoming possibly too strong on that one certain character. A relevant example will be the NERFS causing nerfs to the perk Predator, or more recently, Singularity causing nerfs to the perk Haywire. These are two prime examples of perks being bottlenecked by the existence of a character that makes them too strong. However, it has happened continuously in Dead by Daylight's history, affecting the game for years at a time. Believe it or not, the NERFS has been at the very top of the game since she released all the way back in 2016. You could look at this as the beginning of DbD's bottleneck, or you can move it towards more of a time when DbD was more competitive. With the existence of these extremely strong killers, survivor perks have rightfully been buffed to compete with the killers. However, this leaves behind the rest of the cast. At the same time, maps are seemingly being designed with these killers in mind. It's all just a bit of a mess, which to be fair is what DbD has always been. But it does provide a much different experience between killers, not necessarily in the way of making killers feel unique and interesting, but instead making certain killers feel worthless on certain maps, or against certain perks, while the best of the best just don't care about any of it are extremely strong in any situation. In a dream world, you'd hit the top tiers with a substantial nerf and give the lower tiers a substantial buff to get everyone in that golden area of mid-A to mid-B. But I realize this is just my hopes and much easier said than done. If you're wondering, this is my thought process on killer balance. Killers in the B tier are generally speaking pretty good. I mean, they have to be. It's the literal definition of a B tier character. And yeah, tier lists are different, blah blah blah, but as long as we all, generally speaking, agree on where a character is on the tier list, it's fine. I'm not gonna pick hairs over where the knight goes on that list. Anyways, while these are subjective, if you look at any trusted player's tier list, you'll see killers like Nemesis, Freddy, Huntress, Wraith, and more residing in this area. These are all very good killers who can hold their own against the majority of teams. Getting weaker killers around this level gives a good starting point for the rest of the cast to expand from. As for your A tiers, you have to be careful because these killers are borderline overtuned. I've always considered A tiers the pinnacle of strength while still having meaningful counterplay to them. Oni, Plague, Houndmaster, and so on. These are very good killers that survivors can still fight back against them and keep their more oppressive snowball potential from hitting new levels. Again, I realize this is all in a fantasy world and this will literally never happen, but that's just how I feel about killer design. So we've discussed killer in a vacuum, so let's now put forth some cherry-picked survivor changes from over the past year. First things first, the 70-second hook timer. For those who didn't know, survivors would transition to the next hook stage after 60 seconds before patch 8.2.0. Once this patch hit, survivors would take an additional 10 seconds before moving to that next stage. On paper, this sounds relatively fine and even healthy. Once again, the devil, unfortunately, is in the details. This was an indirect buff to perks like Reassurance and Deliverance, as well as some other hook-centered perks. The biggest ones being those two, which are already very solid perks. Reassurance will now allow a survivor to sit on a hook for 100 seconds if a teammate allowed, and Deliverance could be held longer if the killer is deciding to proxy camp. Other indirect buffs were the amount of time survivors can now sit on a generator before going for the save, making camping less effective, which in most cases I think is good, but also made survivors trading in the endgame easier due to giving them more time to be able to fully reset before going for a save. This change I think is honestly kind of overblown by the community. I mean, it was no doubt a good buff to survivors and something that will occasionally cost you a win, but not something that's worthy of so much blame by the community. Judging by how I opened this section, I'm sure you thought I'm against 70-second hook timers. Well, it's more complicated than that. I don't think camping is a healthy mechanic and would like to see it being made less effective, but the downside of survivors being given so much time to just sit on generators before even needing to begin thinking about going for a save has made most killers lose a lot of pressure per hook, in comparison to generator time being allowed. Now we have the meat of the killer troubles right now, in my opinion. There are a few perks that are exceptionally strong right now. Let's start with the one that I think really started all of this. On November 28th, 2024, my awesome and cool birthday, Tori Kane released alongside the Houndmaster in the Doomed Course chapter. She brought with her Treacherous Crows, Clean Break, and Shoulder the Burden. STB for short was immediately heralded as one of the strongest perks Survivor has ever been given. Being able to transfer a Survivor's hook stage instantly is one of the strongest effects the game has ever seen, and believe me, this perk is very, very strong. However, truth be told, STB is one of the rarest perks in the game now. That doesn't really justify its existence. A perk rarely being used doesn't mean it's weak. Trust me, we'll get to that later.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device.
The reason this perk isn't seen often is because the majority of your solo queue Sammies are playing the game in an extremely selfish way and don't want to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of their teammate. Granted, this is a very popular perk in a Swift who is playing very seriously, but the majority of your matches are just not super serious Survive with Friends teams. While STB is a rare perk, it undeniably did shift the strength in the game a lot more than some people would have you believe. Let's now talk about a more recent addition to the Survivor meta, and it's a perk that has been strong for years, but nobody really noticed: Botany Knowledge. The medkit penalty was removed in patch 9.0.0, and this has resulted in Botany rearing its head once more. I'm sure we've all seen it, survivors resetting in seconds with a medkit and Botany. This is an issue because healing speeds are so intrinsically tied to the speed of generators. The speed at which a survivor heals, the faster that the generators are able to be done. Granted, survivors could stay injured, but then they are able to be downed much faster. Sure, you do the gens faster, but there's a risk to it. Now, that risk has been removed, while all of the reward is still there. I tried to find a low pick rate killer perk to compare this to, and I landed on Forced Hesitation. Forced Hezi is sneakily a very strong perk, allowing a killer to harshly tunnel a survivor off hook. It's grossly designed, but fortunately not very popular. If perks are buffed off pick rate, would a perk like this be in line for a buff? I really don't hope so. In order to not sound like a doomer, just making baseless presumptions, I'm gonna move on, but I do hope the example makes sense. Continuing with this idea of resets being incredibly fast, Resurgence also received a huge buff this year in patch 8.1.0, raising it to 75% of progress on your healing. This, for the same reason as Botany, has made it much harder to keep pressure up as a killer. I'm not going to do another healing angry rant, so just copy and paste the Botany rant and put it here too. This is maybe a hot take, but Exhaustion as a whole is disproportionately stronger against mid-tiers. I'm not really sure where to go with this, because I think there's a lot of genuine skill play to be done with Exhaustion. Perks like Dead Hard, Smash Hit, or Balanced Landing spring to mind for me immediately. But there is such little interaction for a perk like Sprint Burst or Lithe. Balance requires you to position yourself well on the high ground to try and take advantage of it to make some distance. Dead Hard requires you to bait the killer to swing at you. Smash Hit requires you to get the bare minimum of a stun. Lithe has slowly become one of the most crutch perks in the game, replacing the need to loop the killer with Vault the Window and Disappear. It's a staple of DbD at this point, so I don't really see the mechanic getting a major rework. However, I do genuinely think Exhaustion is the closest equivalent to slowdown for a survivor. Something the role has really relied on, the only difference being that one of them has had major changes over the years and the other just hasn't. I could be wrong about this, I just personally find a lot of the current designs to be incredibly dull, but hey, Killer has a lot of boring stuff that they can do too. The last thing I want to bring up is a personal one. Hey Quentin, why did you bring Vigil to this game? So, I'm not the first person to talk about Vigil, and I certainly won't be the last, but quite frankly, this perk is ridiculous. It hard counters 2 killers just because. Further buffs Exhaustion and counters Mangled. It's ludicrous. The funny thing is, these aren't even all of the ludicrous perks that Survivor got this year. Duty of Care, Babysitter, Dark Theory, We're Gonna Live Forever, and others were also made much better. What killer perks were made exponentially better this year? Well, much like the killer buffs, I went through every patch and came up with the following perks: Oppression, Trail of Torment, Machine Learning, Dead Man's Switch, Leverage, Remember Me, Fire Up, Unbound, Batteries Included, Furtive Chase, Call of Brine, Thrilling Tremors, and finally, Thwack. Now that is a lot of perks. Those aren't even all of them. Those are just the ones I considered major improvements. Out of all these, the only ones in my subjective experience that sees common usage are DMS, Leverage, and maybe Fire Up? There were a lot of swings, but really not even that many home runs. So what does all this mean? Is behavior scared to buff killer in a meaningful way? Well, no. As we saw at the beginning of the video, there were some huge buffs to the killers this year, as well as some smaller buffs to improve the overall strength of the killer role, and every killer that released this year is relatively strong. The issue, in my opinion, as a DbD veteran who has seen the game at its highest and lowest, the proverbial pendulum is swinging back. 6.1.0, which I covered recently, buffed the killer very hard. This is the effect of that. Eventually, things were going to swing back towards Survivor being stronger. This is just how Dead by Daylight is. And while it'd be ideal to find a nice spot in the middle where both roles can be well balanced and not see all of their best perks nuked, that's just not how the game works. The issue with DbD that we're seeing and being exemplified by the buff to botany knowledge, desperate measures, and reassurance is the lack of a counter meta to properly fight these perks. Sure, you can use Weeping Wounds paired with leverage to counter it, but even that doesn't do a whole lot when the survivor comes off the hook mostly healed. Franklin's Demise destroys the survivor's medkit, but the healing speed is still very fast in comparison to what it was pre-patch because the perks weren't in play. Fast heals with no way to properly stop them is a difficult spot for a killer to be in. So the way I see it is that there are two options for this situation. One, you could revert the buff to the healing perks and return them to pre-buff state. I mean, this is the most likely scenario, but honestly kind of the least interesting for the future of the game. And the second, and more exciting thing you could do, I think, is to buff killer perks to compete with this meta. See, the major thing with the healing meta, and why I don't blame people for using it, is the following. First, I mean, it's the meta. People are always going to use the best stuff. And secondly, it just makes Survivor feel so much better to just be resetting that fast. Killer perks with low usage rate like No Quarter or Nurse's Calling could be buffed to make their anti-heal capabilities more effective. You can also take killer perks with low pick rates like Bloodhound or Overwhelming Presence and rework them into anti-heal perks. Killer generator slowdown is a bit weak right now still. It's the best option. But if your best option isn't that great, then how much is it really doing for you? Expanding the killer meta past 4 generator slowdowns would expand build variety while also freshening up the game a bit more for everyone. At the end of the day though, we've seen this before. Like I said earlier, killer has been in a rough spot before, which I think a lot of people are overblowing how much harder the game really is. I would say it is a bit harder to keep your pressure up in comparison to even just a few months ago. To be honest, this ended up being a massive project of mine. It was originally a video covering botany knowledge, but quickly turned into a huge overarching coverage of Killer from VECNA to Springtrap. Again, I think Killer isn't in the worst state it's ever been, but it's definitely struggling a bit more than usual. As for today though, all we can do is play the game and hope it gets better. If you enjoyed the video, please do leave a like. If you really enjoyed the video, you can subscribe and catch my next one. Let me know what you think about Killer in the comments below. If you want to hang out with me, you can check out my Twitch channel or join our Discord server. But that's going to be it for me today. This is Kasir, signing off. I hope I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.